Today is Wednesday, March 19th, 2025. This is Quick Start from CBN News. I'm Dan Andros. The ceasefire in Gaza collapses. We'll have that top story and more on today's podcast, where we bring you news from a Christian perspective. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a rating. You can email us your thoughts as well. Quick Start Podcast at cbn.org. Joining me today to get through all the news of the day, CBN's Raj Nair. Billy and Trey are on assignment. On the focus story, Raj, a disturbing scene as swastikas are marring a Jewish gravesite.
Yeah, this is egregious. This is horrific, but this story is also very, very personal to me.
All right. We'll have the details on that coming up here in just a moment on the focus story. And on the main thing, Pastor Andrew Brunson says God gave him a vision while he was imprisoned in Turkey. And he says it reveals what must be done to endure spiritual darkness. CBN's Gary Lane has more on that coming up. All right, the news in 90 will be up here in just a moment, right after this.
Tell you the God's gonna cut you.
It's Holy Week in Jerusalem, and the city is restless. The people of Israel welcome Jesus as king, his followers ready for revolution. But instead of taking the throne, Jesus turns the tables.
Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees! How will you escape being condemned to hell?
Experience Holy Week like never before.
What have you done?
Coming soon to theaters, The Chosen, Last Supper. Get your tickets now.
All right, thanks to our friends over at The Chosen for sponsoring the Quick Start podcast. We're going to head to the news in 90 now. NASA astronauts Suni Williams and Barry Wilmore have begun their return journey to Earth after an extended 286-day mission aboard the ISS. They were supposed to be only slated for an 8-day mission, but they had technical issues with Boeing's Starliner spacecraft, which led to them being there way longer than they had hoped. The astronauts, along with NASA's Nick Hague, departed the ISS aboard a SpaceX Dragon capsule on March 18th. During their mission, Williams and Wilmore conducted numerous experiments, performed maintenance tasks, and participated in spacewalks. Their return marks the conclusion of a mission that significantly exceeded its original duration. And the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas is officially over. Early yesterday morning, Israel warplanes launched widespread airstrikes in Gaza after Hamas refused to extend the truce and released hostages. Those are just some of today's top headlines. You can check out more stories over at cbnnews.com. And Raj, I know you had a quick video on YouTube yesterday about the astronaut there talking about his faith, which was really cool to see, because this is just crazy that they've been up there that long and it's taken SpaceX to sort of bail them out. And an 8-day mission is supposed to be. They're up there for almost a year. I mean, that's just insanity, but great to see his faith in the midst of all that. And then also the ceasefire. We can get your reaction to both of these stories, but the ceasefire, obviously, Trump and Israel both promised problems for Hamas if they didn't capitulate and say, hey, get these hostages back, which, of course, they didn't. And so here we are.
Yeah, I think you are seeing basically Israel trying to knock Hamas back onto the table. But I just talked with an IDF major for another story, and he's like, "Listen, I don't know if this is going to work. If you're asking me to crystal ball it, I think we might have to knock them a couple of times more because right now they're starting to see a little daylight between the United States and Israel. So everything's a test. Does this work? Does that work? But at the end of the day, Hamas is unquestionably rebuilding in Gaza. So it's the value of the human life of the hostages versus basically letting Hamas not only live to fight another day, but completely regroup.
Yeah, definitely troubling scene indeed. Of course, we need to be praying for wisdom there and for Israel to, and America to hopefully act in a way that we can get this thing done and get on a path to a brighter future for everyone over there, because it's just crazy what's been going on and what's been allowed to fester there with the terrorists and everything else over the past couple of decades. So We're going to move on now to the focus story. And as we kind of touched on there at the top, it seems like there's another egregious anti-Semitic incident somewhere in the world, just about every day now. But the new one you just reported on, Raj, in Slovakia, extremely personal to you. Tell me about what happened here and why that is.
Yeah, this is in a little town off the beaten path in middle of nowhere Slovakia named Humene. And why this is so personal is I was part of a documentary about a Holocaust survivor named Irving Roth who survived Auschwitz, and he was from this exact city. And so I've been to this cemetery. It's literally off the way I've described the cemetery is it's one of those places where you feel like you almost have to pull the vines back off the metal bars and climb. You have to go out of your way to find this.
It's not like sitting there next to the highway or something like that, right? Where you're just driving by it every day and you see it.
Exactly. And to go into this place where the community was decimated by the Nazis, and then to draw on Jewish graves, swastikas, it's just such a vile act of hate that it's not almost, it is demonic. And it just literally spits on the grave of my personal friend, Irving Roth, who's recently passed away. And I think to myself, I was filming him talk to, kids in Humene about don't let this happen again a few years ago. And now it's literally happening again in that same town. So for me, not only is it an insult and personal, it's like, wow, this evil of anti-Semitism, it doesn't go away. It just morphs. It just changes. It just rebrands over 4,000 years. And here we are again.
Yeah, it's certainly troubling. And so what happened to the thriving Jewish community of this town during World War II?
Yeah, so it's not that big of a town, but they had about 2,200 Jewish citizens deported to the concentration camps. Dan, 176 survived and returned home. A lot of orphans, a lot of one members of the family, including Irving. He came home and there was you're one of those Jews that survived. There was a little racism. So today, not a single person that's Jewish is living in Humene. The active Jewish community no longer exists. So once you had this beautiful, thriving Jewish community in Humene, and one of the only memorials to the fact that this Jewish community ever existed is this cemetery, that someone went out of their way to climb a fence over vines, over bars, and spray paint with a swastika, the image of the people that literally exterminated this town. It's a different level of evil, my friend.
Yeah, and the anti-Semitism that's been popping up everywhere. I mean, throughout history, we've seen it, from Haman to Hamas, as some have said after the October 7th. We've seen this happen time and time again, but you look in a community like this and it's like, good grief, guys. Like there's, like you said, no more Jewish people there. What are you doing? What are you so mad at? I mean, like this would be like, I don't know, us going over to some conquistador thing and being like, let's go ahead and, deface this thing up, when it's like they've been long gone, like I don't get it. I mean, I do get it, but at the same time, it's unbelievable every time we see it happening.
And it's happening all over the world. And I have personal Jewish friends that were good friends of ours when we lived in New York. They live in Australia. They're Jewish in Australia. They're terrified. I have friends in the UK that are Jewish. They're terrified. If you go to Netanya, a city in Israel, a lot of the people there speak French. Why? Because the French Jewish people are so scared to be openly Jewish in Paris that a lot of them have emigrated. They make what they call aliyah to Israel. So you're having, from literally all over the planet, Jewish people once again scared. But as you said, this isn't new. The Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Romans, the Nazis, they've all tried to eradicate this one tiny people group. And yet all of those civilizations don't exist. And yet the Jewish people are back in the same land, using the same language, worshiping the same God on the same hill, reading the same book, using the same currency. It screams that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is faithful, and that promise has an enemy, and that's anti-Semitism.
Yeah, and so then it makes you think, well, I mean, why do we keep seeing it pop up? And then you just can't help but think the enemies of God rising up and just saying, like this is kind of like a natural reaction in a sinful state, in a state apart from God, where you hate the things of God, right? Like naturally, this is where it's going to lead. Like you wouldn't, which is why you don't see it on like other random. And the incredible thing is like even over Islam, which is actively out there trying to kill all of the people that don't, all of the infidels, and you don't even see this level of hate towards Islam that you do towards Israel. It's crazy.
Well, the demonic hate of anti-Semitism is a shape shifter. I mean, people say, well, I'm not anti-Jewish, I'm just anti-Zionist. That's like saying, I don't hate the Dutch people. I'm just not a big fan of people from Holland living in the Netherlands. It's like your word semantics don't change the fact that you hate Jewish people. And so to me, it's just a rebranding. It's just Here's the thing. If you were to do Nazi style anti-Semitism, well, I might be speaking too fast. That isn't kosher right now, at least. But being against the Jewish state, that's totally cool. And if you look throughout history, from the Russian pogroms to the Spanish Inquisition to the Crusades, it always rebrands itself to be politically correct in that season, but it's the same evil.
Right. And like you see people saying things like, now you reported on this recently too, like, oh, what, I can't criticize the state of Israel. It's like, well, yes, you can, but you're not just doing that. What you're doing is you're saying that they're the ones committing a genocide. I mean, that is Hamas health authority propaganda right there, right? That doesn't mean Israel never makes a mistake or there's collateral damage and things happen. Like those are two completely different things. You should be
free. It's a way of shutting people.
Yeah.
It's a way of shutting people up, because if you look at people that criticize Israel, look at Israelis. Look at how much they argue over the state of Israel themselves. They're all, literally, there's like a quote unquote civil war brewing because Israelis disagree so much
on how to do it. Yeah.
Criticizing Israel is not the problem. Singling out the Jewish state and ignoring the other genocides, ignoring what's happening in Syria, in North Korea, in Iran, in Sudan, in Yemen, down the line, and just focusing on the Jewish state when they're the victims of what happened on October 7th, a barbarity that we haven't seen since the Middle Ages, and calling them the aggressors, it takes some gusto.
It really does. And I mean, listen, I'll never forget, I went to Israel in 2018, I believe it was, whichever year it was that Trump moved the embassy back to Jerusalem. And there were a lot of protests happening in Gaza at the border. And I went down there and I'm standing there on the Israel side looking at the Gaza border. I'm just seeing like they're burning stacks of tires on that side. And the whole media was in outrage that Israel was just gunning down all of these hapless protesters. Now, what Jonathan Conricus told me at that time at that border, the video's out there on YouTube if you want to find it. It's incredible. But he's sitting there and he's like, look, all I can tell you is this. This is their words on their websites. And he shows me the maps. And it's a map of them breaking through. This is what Hamas people, they posted this on their side. Lines going into the kibbutzes and saying that they wanted to kill Israelis. That is exactly what happened on October 7th. That map that they laid out was the exact thing that they did. It was what Israel said that they were trying to do, and that's why they were taking it seriously at the border, and everyone yelled at them for that. Everyone yelled at them for that. But if they were there at the border that day with the IDF, you wouldn't have had what we had on October 7th, but they're certainly trying to do it. It was an eye-opener for me.
Yeah, and saying what happened on October 7th was Hamas going into these kibbutzes to kill people is underselling what actually happened. What you had was Aztec style ripping things apart. I don't want to get too graphic.
Women,
but
it's horrible.
Everything you can possibly imagine. I've had friends who we actually did a video about this, this one friend of ours had to watch all the videos to kind of categorize them. And the stories he told, he's like, I didn't think this was possible in humanity. And so if they just went around shooting people, that'd be one thing. But what they did shows the true demonic nature of what Hamas is all about.
And then, which again underscores how utterly evil and absurd it is that you turn around and then blame Israel and criticize Israel more than Hamas at this point. It's very, very tough to take, and something that people hopefully continue to push back against in the days and weeks to come. But appreciate you bringing that one to the podcast today, Raj. And coming up on the main thing, Pastor Andrew Brunson says God gave him a vision while he was imprisoned in Turkey. Why that matters coming up in 30 seconds.
Let me tell you the God's gonna cut you.
It's Holy Week in Jerusalem. Crowds welcome Jesus as king. Rebellion is in the air.
Jesus operates outside our jurisdiction.
Rome will descend on us all.
But instead of taking the throne, Jesus turns the tables.
My house shall be called a house of prayer, but you make it a den of thieves.
The world will never be the same. Coming soon to theaters, The Chosen: Last Supper. Get your tickets now.
All right, again, thanks to our friends at The Chosen. That's actually where Trey is headed to this week. He is going there to help preview season 5. He'll be talking to Dallas and all the other people involved in there. So look forward to that content coming soon. All right, Pastor Andrew Brunson said God gave him a vision while he was in prison in Turkey, and he says it reveals what must be done to endure spiritual darkness and hardship in our own lives. It's been about 6 years since his unexpected release, and CBN's Gary Lane has more on that story for today's Main Thing.
More than 6 years have passed since Pastor Andrew Brunson's unexpected release from a Turkish prison. And now the world focuses on a different hostage crisis. I recently asked Brunson to share his thoughts given his unique perspective.
These hostages are being held unjustly, maybe not in a prison, but in a tunnel, many of them in Gaza, underground. What emotions do you feel? What are your thoughts when you see these hostage families and you see the hostage release?
When I see the reunions, it really moves me because I remember just the desperation, the desperate longing I had for freedom and to be with my family. And so then I see these people coming together after not knowing if they'll ever see each other again. And I know what they're feeling.
Brunson spent 23 years as a missionary in Turkey, sharing the gospel and planting churches. In 2016, Turkish authorities arrested him on terrorism charges for allegedly assisting the Kurdish minority and sentenced him to life in prison. Today, Brunson remains grateful to President Trump for what he describes as unprecedented efforts to negotiate his release. Upon his return to the United States, Trump invited Brunson and his wife Noreen to the Oval Office.
I remember when we prayed for him, I in the Oval Office said, "Can I pray for you?" He said, "Well, I probably need prayer than anyone else in this, more prayer than anyone else in this room." And I think it is true.
Like many Americans, Brunson believes God intervened to spare Trump's life last year in Butler, Pennsylvania. Although the Trump administration has made strides toward family and faith-friendly policies, Brunson believes the country's anti-Christian bias has a strong foothold and is deeply ingrained.
It will bring a delay, but I think the culture as a whole has already become post-Christian. And when we came back from Turkey, I came back to a different country. And I think in the last years especially, there was an acceleration toward a very aggressively anti-Christian position, especially by the ruling elite, you could say. Every institution in our country is led by people who are post-Christian and increasingly anti-Christian.
So those extreme pressures will rise up again after Trump.
I think they will because the culture hasn't changed. Our culture is actually very quickly turning away from God.
Brunson predicts the United States and other Western nations will eventually become less inclined to defend religious freedom. As a result, regional powers will rise to fill the void.
I think that Turkey, Russia, and Iran will move together in some alliance. I had a dream about this in prison that was from God. I have very few dreams from God, but this was one. And I saw them moving in a dark alliance. This was in 2016, before they started to move together. And then it started to happen. And so I think there are spiritual ties there. But I think there is an alliance that will continue in a darker direction, and that will it will eventually, in the end, try to undermine Israel, yes.
Brunson always felt strong as a missionary. Then, when isolated in prison, despair overtook him, and he felt abandoned by God. Speaking at a recent Regent University chapel, he explains that his wounded heart led him into a spiritual crisis.
I began to question God's existence And the first time I did that, I began to cry. I said, how could this happen? I've started churches, I've baptized Muslims, and here I've taught and preached for years, and now I'm even questioning whether God exists. I had many questions for God, and I became aware at some point that God had questions for me. Andrew, are you going to love me when you don't see my love? Are you going to be faithful to me when you don't see my faithfulness?
Brunson predicts American Christians will also face difficult times ahead. He encouraged students to stay strong in the face of adversity, even when God's presence is not felt.
You have to survive those times of crisis. You have to remain faithful. Your devotion to God is being tested, and you have to hold on to Him, even when you don't understand, even when you don't have answers. Will you love Him when you don't see His love? Will you be faithful when you don't see His faithfulness?
Brunson believes that people can endure when they learn to recite what God says about Himself.
I had to make a conscious decision to repeat again and again, no, God, you are faithful. You do love me, even if I don't feel it, even if I don't see it. You are good. You are true. And to say these things, even when my emotions are in turmoil and in darkness, but with my will, I can choose to speak what is true.
Guidance from Brunson's experience, trusting God while facing life's challenges. Gary Lane, CBN News.
All right, Gary, appreciate that conversation, man. That's pretty good stuff there from Pastor Brunson. I mean, jeez, I mean, you never know until you're in that situation how you're going to react, and that's a great response from someone who, man, was really, really put the test to the test that most of us will probably never, ever see. But appreciate that, Gary. And that's going to leave us with time on the podcast today for one last thing. We're going to take a look at John 10, 27 through 30. My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. I give them eternal life, and they will never perish, and no one will snatch them out of my hand. My Father who has given them to me is greater than all, and no one is able to snatch them out of the Father's hand. I and the Father are one. So a great reminder there that our salvation's secure, that God knows our name, and then also when you're sharing the gospel, that you don't have to have these amazing arguments, but his sheep will know his voice.
Yeah, and that's the story of Israel, right? No matter how many times they rebelled, he was faithful. And to see that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is still doing his thing, is still keeping his promise, even when there was plenty of times over the millennium not to think that this was happening. We serve a God that keeps his promises, keeps his covenant, and is worthy of your trust.
Amen. All right. Good spot to leave it on this edition of the Quick Start Podcast. As always, make sure you're getting on over to cbnnews.com and faithwire.com for more news from a Christian perspective. Lord willing, and that creek don't rise up on us, we shall return here tomorrow with more news from a Christian perspective. God bless. We'll see you then.